Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Bride's Abandoned Baby. Chapter 1. We've been together ever since we were teenagers, and I just proposed to her, Ethan said, not for the first time. It also wasn't the first time his words brought groans from the men around him. Ethan didn't care and just went on speaking. It wasn't like they were truly bothered, he knew, or else they would have shut him up properly already. We'll get married as soon as I return from this cattle drive, Anne. And you'll marry at the ranch, John completed for him with a roll of his eyes. And your Cynthia is probably plannin' it all back there with your mama right now, Jack continued. And you think you know which dress she will wear, John started again. All right, Ethan said with a laugh. If he and the others weren't on top of their horses and all exhausted from the cattle drive, he'd have punched their shoulders or tried to trip them up. You can't fault a man for bein' excited. You only marry once. You should pay attention to what you're doin', is what you should do, John berated him with a shake of his head. Your girl will be there waitin' for you. Do you want to fall off that horse and bust a leg? I'm payin' attention, Ethan retorted. You're the one not payin' attention to anythin', old man. I see that bottle you're hidin' in your coat, don't think I haven't seen you drinkin' from it about 3 times already. What's that, John? Jack complained, sounding both mortally wounded and offended. You got something there and you didn't share? How could you? Ethan laughed, then the two followed. They didn't actually know each other that well, they'd all been hired for this cattle drive and were heading home. They just happened to take the same road to the next town over. But Ethan liked them, and he would miss them, like he missed all the men he met while on the job. They were usually good men, good company. He'd be sad to see them go, knowing it was unlikely they would meet up with each other again. They promised to visit him someday, though, so he could show off his wife to them, and that was enough. Ethan was distracted anyway. He wanted to arrive home in the worst way. He couldn't wait to marry his sweetheart, his Cynthia. They'd been together 2 years now, more or less, and he couldn't wait for them to be truly together. She was a beauty with brown hair and brown eyes, and he couldn't stop thinking about the young uns they would have, with her hair and his eyes, or maybe the opposite. He was a man looking forward to his future, utterly delighted with the hand God had given him. He was so caught up in thoughts of her, of his family, of the ranch and the wedding, that he didn't see the snake until it was too late. Look out! Jack barked harshly. There's a prairie snake, Ethan's mind supplied in the second he saw the thing before his horse caught sight of it. That quickly, everything went wrong. His mount neighed in a panic, rising on its hind legs. Ethan twisted the reins in his hands, bringing them close to his chest, shouting in alarm. The other 2 men circled him, but there was no way for them to help, no way for them to approach without putting themselves in risk as well. Ethan worked to calm his horse, to make sure no harm came to either of them. He tightened his legs, trying to get himself on a firmer seat, trying not to let the reins slip in his sweaty grasp. I'll hold on, he thought, I won't be stomped or worse. He was so worried about calming his spooked horse that he forgot what had scared it in the first place. He forgot about the snake until his horse's neighs turned into a shrill scream that drowned out any shout of warning the other 2 men might have let out. Ethan shouted as well, panic rising in his chest and taking hold of him. The snake had clamped onto the horse and sent it into a terrified frenzy. It galloped forward, uncoordinated, and almost crashed against one of the other men before it veered off course and started to spin around, desperate to get the snake off its leg. It screamed and fell, and Ethan managed to indeed hold on, his hands firm like stones around the reins. In an instant, he realized he should have let go. He hit the ground with his shoulder, sending a fiery, piercing pain down his spine. Then the horse fell on top of him with all the weight of a heavy, hard-working animal. Words escaped him completely. He had no way to describe the pain anymore, no way to conceptualize it, he just screamed. From the corner of his eye, he watched the snake slither from the scene, leaving him behind to deal with the agony. Ethan woke up feeling bleary and exhausted, though not the bone-deep, satisfying exhaustion one felt after a long day of good work well done. It was a wounded kind of tiredness, his body trying to recover, pulling all its forces toward that, leaving him struggling to even blink against the harsh sunlight entering the room through a half-open window. In a flash, he remembered everything: the cattle run, his friends, his horse, and the snake. Fear gripped his throat and he gasped, suddenly terrified again. His body hurt and he didn't have the courage to look down and see what had truly happened to him. "Mr. Kent?" Ethan looked up at the voice. The man was standing right next to the bed he was lying on, but Ethan had been so choked by fear that he hadn't noticed him. By his clothes and the steadiness of his hands, Ethan knew he was a doctor, and his heart immediately went to his throat. "You're awake," he reminded himself. "That means everything is all right. It means at least the worst is over. The doctor is here to check up on you, nothing more." "Doc," Ethan greeted him with a hoarse voice. He coughed, wreaking pain through his body. The doctor quickly helped up him to a sitting position so coughing would not be so harsh on him, and after a few minutes, he turned and fetched Ethan some water. Ethan drank gratefully, feeling a bit more human afterward. He licked his chapped lips and lifted his intense blue-gray eyes to the other man. "Thanks," he said, his voice a bit smoother now. "How are the others? Are they okay? Did their horses fall, too?" "The 2 men who were with you are just fine, you and your horse were the only ones hurt," the doctor said. "They left already, too much in a hurry to linger, but they left you some coins to help you with getting home now you can't sell your horse for a train ticket anymore." Ethan felt a pain in his chest. "My horse couldn't recover. And you, Mr. Kent?" "I'm sorry, we saved your leg, but we couldn't do much more." Ethan gripped his shirt over his heart, his hands shaking. "Doc, I'm alive," he said, "and if you saved my leg, what's the trouble? I'm going to be just fine. I'll get back home and work on the ranch, no little accident is going to ruin my life." "Your leg is never going to function the same way again," the man said gently. He had kind brown eyes, and they fit a doctor well. Ethan stared up at them, uncomprehending. "You'll walk with a permanent limp, maybe even need a cane. The horse was heavy and loaded with your belongings. It's a miracle you're as well as you are right now, Mr. Kent." "A limp?" Ethan repeated, struck with despair. How serious was it? How could he live with a bad limp? How could he work? The ranch was hard, rough work. Ethan's body had never failed him, and he couldn't believe that it would fail him now. Had the fall been that devastating? He blocked the memories as soon as his own thoughts made them surface. He didn't want to remember any of it. He knew instantly that, yes, it had been that bad. Yes, it was a miracle that he still had his leg at all. "I see," Ethan said, his voice low and eyes averted. He'd find a way. He had to. His hands closed in fists beside his hips. Limp or not, there was still life to be had. There was Cynthia and their future family to think of. Ethan wasn't going to give up, he had to get back to Pine Ridge, Colorado, and continue his life. Maybe the leg will get better, he thought a bit desperately. Maybe the doc is wrong. And, the doctor said, one more thing. "What is it?" Ethan asked, glancing up at an effort at politeness. The doctor's expression was one of sympathy. Ethan dreaded his next words. "The damage was to more than your leg. I'm almost sure that it's unlikely you'll ever be able to have children." Ethan stared up at him, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What?" he croaked out. "I'm sorry," the doctor said. And that was that. Chapter 2. Both Ethan's mama and Cynthia were waiting for him at the train station when he arrived home, miraculously on time. He was weary and tired, not yet recovered from everything that had happened to him and anxious about their reactions. He hadn't managed to tell them before he arrived. A letter would take longer than he would to get there. With his friends' coins and the kindness of sympathetic strangers, he managed to get help enough to get to this train on time. He left the train car with a cane to support his injured right leg, though the doc was sure that eventually he'd be able to move without it. He hoped so and prayed for it. Ethan squared his shoulders and limped into the station with a head held high, looking for his family. They'd still accept him, he knew. They'd still love him. They would manage on the ranch somehow. Life had to go on. His father had saved some money in the past months, and it'd probably be enough to get a cowhand to help them while Ethan recovered enough to resume work. As it was, he was exhausted already. His mother caught sight of him, and her face brightened with pure joy, as did Cynthia's when she turned around, though less exuberant. His Cynthia was a reserved woman, he thought, and that was fine. He still knew she was happy to see him. He grinned and started to hobble his way to their side. He averted his eyes, but still caught the beginnings of their wide-eyed, confused expressions when they saw the stiff way he was moving now, his wobble, an obvious sign that something was terribly wrong. "Cynthia," he exclaimed when he got close enough, letting his small bag of belongings fall to his feet. He wanted to rush forward, to hold her by the waist and twirl her around, but he couldn't. He settled for a tight hug and a kiss to the top of her head. Maybe later, he'd be able to dance again. He hoped he'd be recovered enough at their wedding to do it. He did the same with his mother, giving her a hug and a kiss, and received a pleased giggle from her. Obvious trouble or not, his mama was glad to see him. "Oh, my boy," she exclaimed, drawing him to arm's length so she could take a better look at him. Her eyes roamed him from top to bottom before she narrowed her eyes. She had a look on her face like she knew he hadn't been eating right when he'd been away, and she was going to fix that as soon as possible. "What happened to you? Why are you with that cane? Don't tell me there was an accident or something." "I'm good, Mama," Ethan said. I have so much to tell you. It was a snake. It spooked my horse, but good. My horse didn't make it, it was so bad. Doc said I was lucky to keep this leg at all, and that it will never be the same again." His mother sent him a horrified look, quickly drawing him into another hug, this one tighter and shakier. "Oh, Ethan. We didn't know. There was no letter. I'm lucky I managed to arrive back when I said I would," he said. "And then only because some kind folks gave me a long ride to the next town, and my friends gave me some coins. But I'm home now, and though this leg won't ever be the same, I know Pa has enough money for a cowhand, and we'll be just fine." Cynthia had been notably silent during this entire exchange. Ethan cast her a worried glance, but his mother took his attention again. She linked their arms and picked up his luggage, and though it irked him and wounded his pride to let his own poor mother carry weight for him like that, he would not deny that he was relieved. He was tired already, and more than eager to go home. He still had to tell them the worst news, that he would never have children. Maybe the doctor was wrong. He had no idea how Cynthia would react. When they started walking, he noticed Cynthia hadn't followed him. When he turned around to look for her, she was still where they all had been standing, a hand on her chest and her eyes on his leg, a horrified, disgusted expression on her face. 3 days later, Cynthia told him with tears in her eyes that she had to break off their engagement. She took back all her belongings that had found their way into his house in preparation for moving there after the wedding, and she never came back. A month later, Ethan heard from some people at church that Cynthia had left Pine Ridge entirely and married a rich businessman in the East. So, it had been too much for her, after all. Ethan sat down on his bed, on the bed that by now was supposed to be theirs, and put his head in his hands. He couldn't believe Cynthia had run off to marry a businessman in the East, so far away from where they lived in Colorado. Was she so disturbed by the sight of him that she had to flee the entire area? He couldn't imagine a life away from the ranch, and he'd thought she felt the same. He lifted his head, a wounded scowl on his face. Maybe all women were like this. He sucked in his breath and shook his head. How could she? How could she have left him? They'd hardly had 2 minutes together since he'd returned. She hadn't even given him a chance. But who would want him now, anyway? Who would want a man who couldn't even walk right, who couldn't give her children, who would only get worse with age? Ethan decided then and there that he would never go after love again. Chapter 3. Audrey lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. It was unfortunately a familiar ceiling, one she had stared at many more times than she could count. The bed was familiar also, as were the clothes she was wearing and the stink in the air. It wasn't all bad, but it was hard not to loathe where she was, for it meant a chunk of money her mother had to spend on her, it meant she had gotten worse again, it meant she was stuck in bed again for however many days. Her health had taken a turn for the worse, and there she was in the clinic. She didn't remember arriving here, just a sudden dizzy spell while doing some stitching with her mother. Unbidden, her eyes filled with tears. What wouldn't she do to never come here, to never feel bad again? She envied everyone who had their full health, who never had to fear like she feared. A hand reached out and thumbed her tears away, and her mother's face swam into view. She wore a sympathetic look, and Audrey felt chilled. Something bad had happened this time, she knew just by looking at her ma's expression. "It's going to be all right," her ma said softly, patting her head. "It's going to be just fine, my Audrey, just you see." "What happened?" Audrey asked, her voice a whisper. "The good doctor will tell you." The man stepped forward. Audrey hadn't realized he was in the room, but she wasn't startled. Doc Stevens was a familiar sight to her. A usually taciturn, stoic man, he had grown softer with Audrey after the many times he had seen to her in this place. Everyone had, all the nurses and the other patients that came and went. They were all kind. "Miss Clarke," he said politely, his eyes veering away from her face. "I know it's not very polite, but I'm not really that glad to see you again." She gave him a smile. "Me neither, tell me the news." "What was it this time?" "I know something bad happened, even though I just fainted." "You would not be looking away from me if everything was all right." "I believe you need to move away from the city," he told her not for the first time, shaking his head. "This smoky air and all isn't doing you any good. Things have gone too far. And there's something else." She gulped. "What is it?" "I've been concerned about this before. The fevers you've suffered in the past. I didn't mention this, but now." "What?" she cried, her dread reaching higher than ever. "Now that you're grown, I feel obliged to tell you." He glanced at her mother and then continued. "It's unlikely you will ever be able to have children of your own." Audrey gaped at him in shock. "What?" she asked, voice faint. Out of everything that might have happened to her, she hadn't imagined that it could be something like this. How could it be that she could never have children, that she was barren? God would never do this to her. "Audrey," her mother started, but she would not listen. "Doc, please." Audrey tried lifting herself on her weak arms to sit up and try to look at him more clearly. "Why?" "I know I have been having some problems, but I haven't had a fever in a long time." "I know that. It's been the case for some time." He looked remorseful, as though feeling guilty for keeping such news from her. He cleared his throat and told her plainly. "You should get some more rest. I'll explain it to you further, once you get your strength up. Try not to fret. Rest now. I'll be back later." With a nod, he left the room. Audrey covered her mouth with her hands and burst into tears. Her mother immediately gathered her in an embrace, her own eyes shining with tears. "Mama," Audrey said, distraught, "what will I do now? How will I find a husband? No one will understand. What man will want a wife who can't give him children? Oh, Mama, I'll never have my own little ones." The thought was torture to her, she who had always wanted a family, who had always hoped to find a good man who would be a kind and loving father. The chances of her finding someone who would be understanding of her circumstances were more than slim. Suddenly, her life was over before it had ever had the chance to start. She was a good, decent woman, she prayed, she worked hard, why had this happened to her? Audrey realized she would likely spend her entire life alone. "Oh, honey," her mother soothed her as she wept. "It's going to be all right. You know God works in mysterious ways. There's a way, there's got to be. We'll pray, my girl, and you'll see. A miracle will come." "Ma, how can this be?" she cried, shaking her head. "What am I going to do?" "Calm down," her mother said firmly, shaking Audrey's shoulders. Audrey grew quieter, swallowing her sobs so she could listen to her mother. "You know everything happens for a reason." "But Mama," Audrey tried. "None of that," the older woman said, her voice gentling. "Where there's faith, there's hope, Audrey, and you know that. Didn't we survive your father's death? And your sister's? We'll survive this, too." A year later, a miracle hadn't yet come. Oh, how Audrey had prayed. She prayed every night and every morning, and her mother did as well, up to the day a fever got the best of her, and she left Audrey alone. No understanding man had come, and no matter how many times Audrey went back to the hospital, the doctor always told her the same thing: nothing had changed, she was still barren. Audrey sat at the little desk in her kitchen and sewed the last button onto the shirt lying on top her lap. She rested her aching hands at the table and looked up. Her kitchen was by no means large, but it seemed so without her mother puttering around in it. Audrey was utterly alone now. She didn't really have friends, and there was no other family she could call on for support. Work at the factory was harder and harder. She didn't want to be there anyway, for she blamed the harsh conditions for her own faltering health. The doctor had told her many times that if she'd left the factory and moved away from the city, her health would have improved. The fainting spells and weakness, maybe, but nothing was going to cure her barrenness. She closed her eyes. "Please, God," she prayed, clutching the shirt in her hands. "Please give me a sign. Give me something. I don't ask for you to fix everything, I know it's not like that. But please, show me things will change. I can't keep on like this." There was no answer, of course, because that wasn't how God seemed to work. She opened her eyes and resisted a sigh, and yet hope remained in her chest. There was still faith in her. Things would go right, she hoped, they would, she just had to wait, she just had to try and take the right path when God pointed it out to her. Almost as if in answer to her thoughts, her gaze suddenly caught on the newspaper on top of the desk in front of her. It was wrinkled from having been caught in the rain earlier. It was folded awkwardly, as if to showcase a certain part without caring for keeping the other parts aligned or readable. It was creased in such a way that the part showcasing the mail-order bride adverts was facing up and utterly impossible to ignore. She remembered another worker having handed this to her without a word. Now she understood why. She'd seen a lot of young girls at the factory go out to seek a better life in the West as mail-order brides. From what she'd heard from the other girls, the scant news they had gotten back from the brides was good. They were happy, now, there in the West, far away from home. If she placed an advert, Audrey thought suddenly, she could be upfront about being barren, and have the chance to find a man who would know about it and even choose her, knowing about it. A part of her doubted that such a man even existed. Perhaps, a widower would choose her? Who else had a reason to go after a barren woman? A man who couldn't have children either, Audrey thought suddenly, someone as tired and disappointed and as hopeless as she was, someone who would understand her entirely. Or, she caught herself wondering with a smile, perhaps a pastor who loved God too much to think about sharing that love with babes. Audrey would like to marry a pastor. What a kind, meaningful life that could be. Suddenly, where before, her future had looked bleak, she caught herself smiling and thinking about the possibilities in front of her. It seemed like there were so many. Perhaps a man would choose her who already had babies for her to take care of. Perhaps an older, kind man with an already settled life would find her, someone who still wanted to share his last years with another. Or a second or third son who didn't care about passing on the family's name, and their family could be his brother's family. Audrey would be happy as a doting aunt. She reached for the newspaper with trembling hands and a tearful smile on her face. She made her decision then and there. It took her 3 endless, anxiety-filled weeks to get a response. By then, her hope had shriveled until it had almost disappeared. She spent every waking moment wondering when or if a man would answer her and why no one had done so yet. She had thought it would take less time than this, but days passed, and nothing came to her, no reply, no inquiry, no questions. And then something did arrive. Audrey arrived back from the fabric warehouse and spotted the letter lying in front of her door. Immediately, her heart leapt to her throat. She bent down to pick it up, uncaring that her body was riddled with aches and that it hurt to do so, and rushed inside her house. She was feeling weak and hungry, but she didn't even take the time to eat some jerky or even toe off her boots before she sat down at the kitchen table and tore the letter open. It was short and simple, even a bit rude, she thought. A man named Carl Nelson, who lived in Pine Ridge, Colorado, had liked her advert. Audrey's eyes widened in shock when she read on. The man hadn't asked to get to know her better, didn't want to engage in courting thought letters. No, he had been much more straightforward than that. He had made an immediate offer of marriage. Audrey stared at the words almost without understanding, her hands trembling. From the envelope clutched in her fingers, a ticket fell, and Audrey realized it was a train ticket to the man's town. Audrey sat and stared. Of course, she had known this could happen. She had put the advert there because she wanted this to happen. She had spent days daydreaming about this. And yet, looking at the letter in her hands, she realized she hadn't expected it to actually take place, hadn't thought any man would accept her, but there it was, proof that a man had not only seen her, but had found in her something good enough that he'd sent her an immediate proposal, without even writing for a few months before deciding. He had accepted her and her inability to have children right away, with no hesitation and no regret. A few tears escaped her blue eyes and landed on the paper in her hands. This was her mother's miracle right here. Her mother had been right all along, even gone, she was now right. Audrey bowed her head and prayed a fervent thanks. Chapter 4. It hurt to leave Boston behind, despite the fact that Audrey had begun to resent it. This was the city she'd grown up in, the city she knew. She quit her job and left the house she had shared with her mother for so long, losing this one last thread she had to her. For the first time in her life, she was glad that they had leased and not owned. Otherwise, she would never have been so free to go. So, along with the dread, there was excitement filling Audrey's chest as she stared out the window of the train. She was on her way to Pine Ridge. They had just crossed the border into Colorado, and Pine Ridge wasn't far at all. They were almost there. Audrey was this close to meeting her future husband, the man who had accepted her for who she was. She caught herself wondering what he was like, what he really looked like, what life was like on a ranch. She wished her mother could have seen her here. Dear Lord, she wished her mother could have been here with her. Maybe a husband who had accepted her would have accepted her mother coming along with her. Audrey was so distracted with her thoughts that she didn't notice the train's screeching halt until people's confused muttering rose up around her. She looked around curiously, and looking out the window, it was obvious the train had stopped. She held her bag close to her chest. What's going on? She thought to herself, anxious. Can it be bandits? Please let it be nothing. A man, obviously one who worked with the train, going by his cold dirty clothes, walked up the aisle. Audrey saw him from afar, and it took a while for his voice to reach her. She relaxed immediately. We're having some problems, he shouted. It will be some time till we can get going again, so get comfortable. It won't take more than 2 hours or so. We're having some problems. It will be some time. Audrey sighed, both in relief that nothing worse had happened and in annoyance. She hoped her man would not be too angry about having to wait for her for a few hours longer than had been arranged, but then, it wasn't like it was so uncommon for trains to malfunction sometimes. Maybe it'd even be good, she thought, a bit giddy, maybe the anticipation would make him all the more eager and happy to see her. She noticed that some people were standing up. She waited for a moment, watching them disembark and linger outside, and decided she would do the same. If the train had stopped and would stay there for a few hours still, she might as well go out for a moment and stretch her legs for a bit. She picked up her bag and went. Audrey walked to the opposite side of the tracks, away from where most folks had gathered, not really wishing for conversation. People would no doubt ask her where she was going alone and why, and she just wanted to be alone with her thoughts for a moment. Still, she kept close to the train and the tracks, afraid of getting lost or not hearing when they would be called back. The air was hotter than she was used to. She thought her mother would like it around here. The heat would have been good on her aching bones. Every few moments, Audrey looked back, making sure people were still around and she hadn't wandered too far away. This place in the country was strange to her, she who had been a city girl through and through, who had never imagined she would leave Boston. She was nervous about being alone, even though she often isolated herself. A wailing cry pierced her thoughts as surely as if it had been a bullet. Audrey immediately froze, recognizing the sound of a desperate baby. The sound was distant but distinct. She blinked and looked around, wondering if a mother with a child had followed her. She remembered more than one young mother from the train. And yet when she looked back, the rest of the people were still on the other side of the tracks, closer to the train than not. The cry she had heard was coming from the other direction. Was it perhaps an animal's cry? But it sounded so much like a baby. Were Audrey's ears not working properly? Her heart on her throat, she decided to investigate. This is the middle of nowhere, she thought to herself as she walked ahead, eyes sharp. There is no way this is a baby. It was probably an animal's baby, she reasoned with herself. After all, if you abandoned a baby in a city, someone was sure to find him. Who'd leave a child behind here, among the dirt and the rocks and the scraggly trees, where it was certain the child would starve in the sun? But it was indeed a baby. The child was hidden in plain sight. It was leaning against a rock near the tracks, but it was so small that it was effectively hidden. Audrey looked down at it with a mixture of horror and pity swirling in her chest, making her feel dizzy. She approached with a thundering heart, her hands shaking, and picked up the small infant. Who could have the heart to leave this tiny one behind? Audrey couldn't comprehend it. She could barely think of doing something like this. She was barren and she wanted a child so badly, she couldn't imagine how someone would leave a baby here, hidden beside a rock, near the tracks where no one stopped, and no one would see. Immediately, the baby's cries petered out. It stared up at Audrey with wide eyes, so dark Audrey couldn't even see the pupils. With the tan skin and the equally dark hair and the fact that it was bundled up in animal skin, this was obviously an Indian baby, one that had been ruthlessly abandoned. Mama, Audrey thought, the start of a whisper to her late mother, and didn't know how to continue. Perhaps with something like, Mama, God really works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? She wrapped her shawl around the baby and held it to her chest, protective and motherly. She couldn't leave it here, she couldn't even think about that. Even if she had wanted to, it felt like her arms were locked around the child tighter than any chain, like no man would be able to take it from her. She knew, suddenly and fiercely, that no one would ever separate her from it. She searched a bit longer, wondering if the mother might be there, hurt perhaps, or even worse. But her searching turned up no one. Where are you? She thought. Where are you? Finally, she realized she'd been right in the first place. This child had been abandoned. She looked down at its wide, wet dark eyes and wondered if it was a girl or a boy. She'd find out soon enough. She heard a call and quickly turned around. They weren't being called back yet, it had just been a husband calling for his wife, but suddenly the last thing Audrey wanted was to linger with this child out here. She quickly rushed to the train, careful not to jostle the baby, and boarded again. She walked to her seat and sat down carefully, minding her soreness and the baby. When she looked down again, eager to see those dark eyes once more, she saw instead that the baby had fallen into a slumber, dead asleep in her arms, its little hands closed tightly around the shawl. Poor little thing, it had to be hungry. Her heart burst with love. Chapter 5. Audrey was relieved when she finally arrived in Pine Ridge. By then, the sun was close to setting, and her legs were cramped from sitting for so long. Her arms hurt from holding up the child, but at least now she knew it was a girl. She picked up her bag and shuffled along with the others to step down from the train. While she was beyond eager to meet her fiancé, she knew that she had to get this child something to eat quickly. She followed the others to the main hall of the station and looked around, her eyes wide, searching for Carl Nelson, the man who had answered her advert. She found him quickly enough, to her great relief, after only a few moments of tired searching. He was holding up a plaque with her name. She made her way to him. He was a tall man, and she was surprised to see the amount of gray in his hair and the lines around his face. He was clearly much older than she had thought he would be, at least some 20 years older than her. She realized suddenly that his answer hadn't said anything about his age or his appearance. "Mr. Nelson," Audrey said, suddenly unsure and a bit shy. She held her baby closer to her chest, almost as a shield, then felt guilty for it. "Miss Clarke?" he asked. At her nod he seemed satisfied, and he looked pleased with her beauty if nothing else. He looked good smiling, Audrey told herself. Older than she'd thought or not, Carl could still be a good man. He had picked her out of many mail-order brides he could have chosen, she reminded herself firmly. He made to pick up her bag for her, then froze when he saw the child in her arms. "Is that a savage child?" he asked, taking a step back. She gaped at the disgust in his face. I found her by the train tracks, near the border," she explained, her arms tightening around the sleeping babe. "She's not mine, but I couldn't leave her. She would have died if no one had picked her up. She's so small, and I know she's hungry." He seemed mollified by the fact that the child wasn't actually hers, that she had just found it. He leaned forward to pick up her bag after all, sending the baby one last disgusted look. "That's fine, then," he said gruffly. "We'll leave it at the church's door or something and head home. Come on, let's go." Audrey stared up at him, uncomprehending. I'm not leaving her," she said. "I found her. I can't just abandon her like that. I have to take care of her now." "Look, Miss Clarke, no wife of mine is going to be raising a savage in my home," Carl snapped, letting her bag drop heavily to the ground. "No wife of mine will raise a baby that isn't mine, much less an Indian one. So either you keep that, or you keep me." Audrey took a step back, then another, suddenly afraid of this strange man. It was obvious, suddenly, frighteningly, that although this man had chosen her, he denied her every chance to get to know him so she could properly choose him. She hadn't. She hadn't chosen this man. This stranger. She had chosen her baby. "I will never abandon her," Audrey said, her voice firm. If God had put this child in her path, she wasn't about to leave the child to someone else. She would not abandon her again, leave her to chance. As an Indian, Audrey knew that the baby would not have the best chances of being adopted by a good family. She didn't have it in her to leave the baby to suffer whatever fate might come her way when she loved this baby already. No. Mr. Carl Nelson was not going to stand in her way. "All right," the man bellowed, obviously angry. "Do what you want." He turned around and left. Audrey stared at his back as he left, her shoulders hunching in protectively. She stood in the middle of the busy station, now completely penniless and with nowhere to go, and with an infant to take care of. Still, Audrey couldn't regret this. If she had stayed in Boston, she would never have found the child, who would have probably died out there. Audrey had just enough money to buy the baby some milk before night fell, but after that, she literally had nothing but the clothes on her back and the few items inside her bag. Pine Ridge was small by the standards of someone who had lived her whole life in Boston, and before long, Audrey had seen both the entire town and the fields around it. It was obvious that there really wasn't anywhere for her to go, no one to take her in, no one who would keep her for the night. She sat on the local church's steps and rocked her baby back and forth. She cooed at her, her eyes wet with tears, and the baby reached up to her with her tiny little grabby hands. Audrey kissed one of them. "Don't worry," she crooned. Have faith, baby, it will be all right. God works in mysterious ways, and a miracle will come soon. You're already a miracle, little girl. You are. It will be all right. God is with us tonight. It was only after she had said the words that she realized she had parroted what her own mother had told her a year before. Back on that fateful day she realized she would never be a mother. Now she was here with a babe on her lap. Tears sprang to her eyes. Oh, if only her mother were here. The woman would certainly know what to do. She would have a plan already, she would have found them shelter, she would not be sitting on the steps of this church like a beggar. Girl, came a low, worried voice, interrupting Audrey's train of thought. Audrey looked up. The woman was utterly beautiful, her graying hair up in a bun and her hands rough, but her eyes a blue-gray that beckoned attention. She reminded Audrey of her own mother, and there was just something in the look this woman was sending her. It was as if she had been summoned by Audrey's thoughts of her ma. Hello, Audrey said in a low voice. It's far too late for you to be sittin' there with a babe, the woman said, gentle but chiding. I'm Maggie Kent. Who are you and what are you doing here? I'm Audrey Clarke, Audrey said. I just got here today. I answered a mail-order bride advert, Mrs. Kent, but the man didn't want me anymore after he saw this baby. I found the child near the train tracks. I couldn't leave her. Mrs. Kent, please, I can't leave her. You and this little one won't be safe if you stay out here, Maggie exclaimed. She sat down beside Audrey and wound an arm around her shoulders, protectively. I live in a ranch on the outskirts of town, girl. Come with me and you can stay as long as you need to, all right? Tears welled up on Audrey's eyes. Mrs. Kent. You stay as long as you need to, Maggie repeated firmly, using her hold on Audrey to help her up. You gotta plan your next move, girl, but you can't do that while starving on the streets. Come with me, I was about to head home. There's warm soup for dinner and a bed for you to rest on. There's even an old cradle for your baby. All right? Thank you, Audrey said, tears sliding down her cheek, relief almost choking her, so strong it was. The ranch was big. That was Audrey's first thought when they exited the wagon and walked inside the house. The house was also big, and Audrey felt immediately at home. Maggie was an angel sent to her, she was sure. The woman had to have brought Audrey to her home with that kind smile on her face and not a lick of judgment in her expression. My husband passed away some months ago, Maggie said quietly, herding Audrey to the Davenport. So, it's just me and my son Ethan working on the ranch right now. I have a daughter, you see, but she's married and off with her husband, so there's an extra room. You can stay in it. All right, Audrey said softly. I have some milk for this babe, Maggie exclaimed suddenly, as if she had just remembered. Just wait a minute. She returned soon with milk and a very large bottle. I'm sorry. The only bottle I could find was one that we used with a baby goat who was orphaned. I cleaned it real good, though. It'll have to do. Audrey passed the baby over so Maggie could feed her. Audrey was glad. She was absolutely filled with relief at the fact that she would have helped with the baby, at least for a little while. The child didn't fuss in Maggie's lap, utterly at peace with a stranger, but then, she had been calm with Audrey as well, who was a stranger to her, too. So, what's this baby's name? Maggie asked. Audrey watched as she rocked the baby, who, satisfied and not hungry, fell asleep on her shoulder. Faith, she decided. Her name will be Faith. Maggie smiled at her. There are some Cheyenne tribes who live in the Rockies around here, Maggie told her, her voice low and soft so as not to wake the baby. This one was probably abandoned or disowned because of an affair or because she's mixed. There's no way to know for sure, but it was probably something like that. I wondered, Audrey murmured, running her fingers gently through the baby's thick black hair. But there is one thing I know for sure, Maggie said, her voice suddenly firm, and it's that you did the absolute right thing by saving this child, Audrey. Audrey sent her a teary smile. I think so too, she whispered. Chapter 6. After that, Maggie went to prepare dinner. Audrey would have normally rushed to help her, but she was so exhausted after the trip that she took the baby and went to the room she where would be staying and took a nap instead. Maggie came to wake her up when dinner was ready. Then she and Faith and Maggie sat down at the table and waited for her son to return. He arrived quickly, as if he knew precisely when dinner would be ready. Audrey looked up from her child and caught his gaze as he stood at the door to the kitchen. He had his mother's steel blue-gray eyes, though on him they were wildly more intense. His jet-black hair fell into his face, hiding part of it, and he had stubble growing in his fair, handsome face. Audrey's heart stuttered in her chest. He glanced at her, then his eyes veered away. Audrey thought she recognized embarrassment in his expression, but what could a strong, young, handsome man like him have to be embarrassed about? He walked into the house, his eyes veering away from her, and she immediately understood why. The man had a marked limp. "Ethan, there you are," Maggie said, happy to see her son. "Come, sit down. The stew looks very good, and we were waitin' for you." "Hello, Ma," he said in a low voice, glancing at Audrey again. He sat down stiffly. "This is Audrey. She and her daughter will stay with us for a while," Maggie explained. "They went through some hardship. She will help us a bit around the house while she's here, too." "All right," Ethan said easily, his voice still low. They prayed together, and then ate. The food was wonderful, but Audrey was much too distracted by the man sitting across from her to notice much of it. He barely made eye contact with her during the meal and responded to Maggie in few words and a low voice. Maggie obviously found this behavior strange, but didn't call it out, simply letting her son answer her stiffly with a kind smile. It was clear something had happened to him, something that hurt him and made him a quiet man. Audrey wondered what it was, then told herself firmly that it was none of her business. She also wouldn't like it if he started asking her questions about her life, and why she was there. He ate quickly before excusing himself from the table. His shoulders were tense as he left, obviously aware of Audrey's eyes on him as he hobbled away to his room. Audrey wondered if the limp was why such a beautiful, striking man was still single, especially now that he had his own ranch. They tried to find Faith's parents, or at least her mother. No matter how much Audrey had grown attached to the beautiful little baby, she didn't have the heart to separate her from her family if there was any chance at all that there was someone searching for her. She also couldn't deny that things for her would be more straightforward and simple if she didn't have a child. Carl Nelson had been a terrible man, but his reaction had been far from uncommon. Audrey knew that not many would accept her as it was, much less with a child that wasn't hers. And so the first order of business for her to get her life straight was settling the matter of Faith. Unsurprisingly, no one was found, and nothing was discovered. Secretly, Audrey was relieved. Though it would be easier for her without Faith, she had already grown to love the child. But in fairness, she knew they had to search thoroughly. Maggie helped her, and even distant Ethan lent a hand. Together, they asked around, showing them the baby and the animal skin she had been wrapped in, even going as far as visiting the other ranches and nearby towns. After a week of searching, Maggie put her hand on Audrey's shoulder and shook her head. They'd only found dead ends, and if anyone had been looking for Faith, they surely would have stumbled upon them already. In her heart, Audrey already thought of herself as Faith's mother, and she had named her. God really had put her on her path. God had answered her and her mother's prayers and given her that which she had wanted more than anything, a baby. Even if Audrey never found a man, she would always have Faith. When they arrived back at the ranch that day, Audrey took Faith to her room and laid her down in the small cradle Maggie had found for her. She touched her fingertips to the child's chubby, rosy cheek, then went to help Maggie with dinner, because life went on. This had been her routine for over a week now. The kitchen was as familiar to her as her own in Boston had been, and Maggie was a wonderful woman. Audrey delighted in helping her and making her life easier. It was the least she could do for the woman who had basically saved her life. Audrey felt so well and welcome here. Maggie was wonderful with little Faith, too, just like a grandmother should be. "It's time to stop overthinking all this," Audrey told herself as she peeled potatoes for Maggie. You're here now and that's it. You can't deny that you'd really rather be here than back in Boston. You've been happier in this 1 week than you've been since your mother died. If Audrey was going to accept that she was going to stay at this ranch longer, she was going to have to start pulling more weight. She would help Maggie more, the woman deserved it. As does Ethan, Audrey thought suddenly. The man had been distant all this time, but it was clear he needed help, and he had helped her in her search for Faith's parents. The ranch was his, Audrey was staying in his home. He deserved all the help she could give. Maggie watched Audrey as the young woman worked with renewed vigor. It was obvious to her that Audrey had a secret of her own, something that made her so anxious about her situation, something that made her come out west to marry a man without hesitation. But it wasn't the time to pry. Maggie was a mother. She knew how to wait, and she trusted the girl besides. She knew Audrey's secret wasn't anything that would put her or her son in danger. She was glad Audrey was here with them, and gladder still to have her help when her lower back pain returned with a vengeance. She groaned, putting a hand on her back, and Audrey quickly gave up on her potatoes to come to her and ask what was wrong. Nothing, girl, just some lower back pain, Maggie said with a groan. I was going to work in the vegetable garden after workin' on lunch, but can you do that for me? I've never gardened before, Audrey said, a bit hesitant, but then she straightened up. But I will learn. Of course, I'll help you, Maggie, don't you worry. Good girl, Maggie said with a smile. There's a lot of work to do, I've been neglecting it for some time now. But you'll like it, I think. Ethan tended the horses and watched, half hidden behind them, as Audrey worked in his mother's vegetable garden. It had been a bit more than a week now since the woman had arrived at the ranch and Ethan hadn't spoken much to her. Truthfully, he was too ashamed of himself, too self-conscious of his leg and the lack of strength in his wounded body to approach the woman. After what had happened with Cynthia, Ethan had sworn off love, sworn off all women. He'd be content on the ranch with his mother, and that was that. But he couldn't deny, much as he tried, that Audrey Clarke was absolutely beautiful. Her long, strawberry blonde hair shone brightly under the sun, and her blue eyes sparkled with joy any time he saw her smiling. Her porcelain skin was already reddening in the sun, turning a charming pink. Maybe he should lend her his hat. He shook his head. He couldn't let his mind drift down that path again. He was shaken from his thoughts by a cry of pain and was halfway to Audrey before he realized he had moved, limp and all. She looked up at him when he approached and smiled awkwardly, as if embarrassed to have hurt herself, her shoulders hunched in and her expression pinched. Let me see, he said quietly. Audrey gave him her hand. She had cut it while mishandling the garden shears, he thought. The cut was deep and would need tending. He squeezed her shoulder softly. It's okay, he said. If it needs stitches, Ma can do that for you. She's got a steady hand. People said she could have been a doctor if she were a man. So, don't you worry. I won't, she said, looking down. How embarrassing to have hurt myself like this. I'd never gardened before, but I thought it'd be all right to learn alone. It's okay, Ethan repeated, shaking his head. Audrey's smile turned gentle and relieved. He led her back to the house, Audrey seemingly not bothered by his slow gait. His ma cried out when she saw Audrey, berating the young woman at the same time she fussed over her. The two women sat down, and Ethan made to leave. Please, Audrey said, then stopped herself. Yes, he asked. Can you stay? She asked, shyly, her blue eyes on the ground. Ethan was hopeless against such a quiet, scared request, and sat down beside her. His presence apparently calmed her, keeping her steady while his mother attended to the wound. Thankfully, it didn't need stitches. Ethan tried to keep his eyes on Audrey's hand, but Audrey's eyes were focused on him instead, roaming his face, lingering on his gaze, gentle and relieved, surprised like she had just seen something beautiful but unexpected. Chapter 7. A month passed. Audrey's hand healed quickly, and Maggie soon gained her help around the house again. Maggie's back pain diminished, and her smiles came easier. She and Audrey made a good team together, tending things around the house and in the garden. This was what she had hoped to have with Cynthia, but she shook her head. She didn't want to think about the woman who had left her son. She sat on the couch with little Faith in her lap and watched, taking a rest, as Audrey swept the room while she hummed under her breath. It was a calm end to the afternoon, and they were waiting for Ethan to arrive while the bread finished baking. Ethan had always arrived precisely when dinner was put on the table, as if loath to leave the rest of the ranch a minute too soon. Yet Maggie wasn't surprised that today he arrived earlier, opening the door and setting his hat on the hook by it almost 20 minutes before the food would be done. He looked up and smiled at Audrey, who smiled back at him. Maggie grinned down at Faith, who gurgled at her with a little gummy smile. Maggie had noticed this and many other changes in Ethan since Audrey had arrived. He spent more time at the ranch house, took part in the conversations more. Maggie had been giving him his space, but she was more than glad to see him come back to life. "Hello," he said quietly. "I'm a bit early again, it seems." "Just a bit," Audrey told him. "It will be done soon. Why don't you go wash up, Ethan? You would be right on time then." "I don't feel right washing up while you're still working," he said with a smile, then turned to Maggie. "Mama, hello. How was your day?" "Just fine," Maggie told him. "Don't you go mama, hello at me when I know you have ulterior motives to approach me right now, boy." Ethan sent her a grin. "What? Ma, why say that to me? Can't a man just want to kiss his ma hello?" His real motive to come close to give her a kiss became clear soon enough. When he sat down beside Maggie, Faith caught sight of him and beamed at him. "Hello, little Faith," Ethan said softly, eagerly taking the little girl when Maggie passed her over to him. Audrey laughed, amused, and so did Maggie. Maggie watched as Audrey approached as well, bending down to press a kiss to Faith's tuft of black hair. Faith giggled, her little eyes closing, and from where Maggie was sitting, these three could almost be a family. Faith's black hair could come from Ethan, while her tan skin looked enough like his, sun-kissed from ranch work as it was. If it weren't for the eyes, dark like neither Audrey's nor Ethan's, Faith would look like their baby. Maggie caught the lingering look shared between the two young people and knew in her heart they were a perfect match for each other. Audrey had all the pragmatism and practicality Cynthia had lacked, as well as strength of heart that Maggie admired. She also had never once made a single comment about Ethan's leg. Maggie listened while the two spoke of nothing in soft voices, their bodies swaying close to each other. All they needed was some time for their eyes to open to the possibility of falling in love with each other. Most definitely, they would be a perfect couple. Cynthia Ramser left the train with a determined step. The station at Pine Ridge was familiar to her now, and she knew the exact route to take to get back home. They weren't expecting her, she hadn't told her parents or her sisters anything, but she knew with the certainty of the loved, that they would take her back without too much fuss. Her stay in the East with her husband Eric had been a short one. He had been rich, but a little over a year after they married, he'd had to file for bankruptcy. Cynthia would not live her life with a poor man away from home, and in one of the letters her sister Lucy had sent her, she mentioned that Ethan was still single and had inherited his father's ranch. That was all the motivation Cynthia had needed to return home. She walked out of the station. Now she was divorced, she was sure she could win Ethan back. She needed a man with means to take care of her. And Ethan had been so much in love with her, she was sure there was still a spark of it in him. He'd be thankful, even, she was certain. What other woman around Pine Ridge would be willing to marry a broken man? Ethan had been making an effort to get to know Audrey better. He couldn't ignore her anymore, she was too kind and too beautiful. Unlike Cynthia, who had left him not 3 days after seeing him like this, Audrey had never commented on his injury, had never said a bad word or sent him a disgusted look. Audrey often heated water for him to help relax his leg and his shoulder and never hesitated to help him across a room on his worst days. He was now, like he had many times before, gazing at her while she worked in his mother's garden. The garden was now more Audrey's than not, his mother hadn't done anything with it since Audrey had started helping her with it. Today, Audrey's beautiful strawberry blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and Audrey again and again lifted a hand to tuck a stray strand behind her ear. Ethan was hopeless. He approached her and cleared his throat. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Ethan," she greeted him. "Do you need anything?" "No," he said, looking away. He put his hands on his pockets. "I was just wonderin', you'll be done with the day's work once you're done with the garden, right?" "That's my plan," she said, curious. "Do you need help with something?" "I was wonderin' if you wanted to go horseback ridin'," he admitted. "If we're both done with work. There's some sun left in the day yet, and it'd be nice." "Oh," Audrey said, surprise making her raise a hand to her chest. "I've never done that before. I'd be so happy to go with you, as long as your ma is fine with watching Faith. But, is it okay for you, Ethan?" Ethan didn't look down at his leg. "It's okay," he murmured. "I can't ride like I used to, and we'll have to go slower, but..." "Then I'd love it," Audrey told him softly, setting a hand on his arm. Ethan lifted his eyes to hers. "I'll teach you the basics, Audrey, and I know you'll do just fine." Chapter 8. Ethan and Audrey went horseback riding together every afternoon that week. He finished work faster and she prepared dinner earlier, and they managed to steal a few minutes for each other, enjoying each other's company like Ethan had thought he never would enjoy anyone's company again. Audrey didn't mind that Ethan couldn't go fast. She didn't complain when they had to stop because of him. She didn't seem to care that sometimes she had to support him as he limped his way into the house. She had been a fast learner and could now ride circles around him. She was an angel. Ethan had told himself he would not go down this road again, but right now, with Audrey helping him shuffle his way home, warm under his arm and with her hand on his chest, it was very hard for him to remember why not. "I'll heat some water so you can bathe when we get inside," she murmured as they walked. "It will help your leg and your shoulder, and I'll ask Maggie to make that tea to help as well. I haven't looked at the finances, but do you think we have enough for a cowhand to help you, Ethan? You mentioned getting one some time ago." "We do," Ethan admitted. "I was going to hire someone, but I ended up never doing it." "You've been doing this to yourself for a year?" "Ethan," she chided. He laughed softly. "We'll look into later, all right?" "All right," she said. "But don't think I'm going to be all right with this for long. This isn't good for you. What will we do if you fall ill?" "I'm not going to fall ill," he reassured her. "I haven't yet, and it's been a year, right?" "Right," she said a bit relieved. Ethan could hardly take his eyes from her. After Cynthia, he thought it'd be impossible, but it was time to move on. A part of him still longed for the woman who had been his sweetheart, but another part of his heart grew warm at the thought of having something more with Audrey. Life can be good, he thought. Likely, even better. A week passed, and Ethan's resolve hardened. Dinner that day had been wonderful, the women had made him his favorite, and it left him feeling warm and hopeful. He lingered at the table after Audrey stood up, as uncharacteristic as that was. He could see his mother looking curiously at him. Usually, he would have followed Audrey back to the kitchen and kept up the conversation. But right now, he was glad that Audrey was out of earshot. "Ma," Ethan said before his mother could stand up as well. "I need to tell you something." She raised her eyebrow, leaning forward toward him. "Yes, what is it, boy?" she asked. "I'm thinking about proposin' to Audrey," he confided, unable to contain a smile. "Oh!" Maggie exclaimed, clasping her hands to her chest. A smile broke over her face. "Really, Ethan? Oh, you have my blessing. You have all of my blessings. I have prayed for this." Ethan laughed, drawing his mother into a hug. It would be fair to say that this would still be a marriage of convenience in a way. Ethan wasn't completely in love yet. But the two of them already had everything else a marriage needed. They were similar in a variety of ways. They liked to talk together, they spent time in harmony, and they both knew how to compromise. Ethan knew that love would surely come. He was looking forward to it. Cynthia arrived at Ethan's ranch on horseback, tired of waiting. Her plan had been to wait until the town's gossip reached Ethan, but the man hadn't ridden to town once since her arrival a few weeks ago, so she had decided to take matters into her own hands. Her parents had a horse she could use, and she knew the way, so here she was. The Kent's ranch house was familiar and comfortable to her. She had spent a lot of time there before. Maggie opened the front door as Cynthia dismounted the horse. The older woman seemed surprised and wary, and Cynthia sent her a sweet smile, brushing her brown braid to her back. "Maggie," she greeted. "It's been so long." "Yes, it's been very long," Maggie said, looking her up and down. Her eyes narrowed. "I'd heard you were back in town but didn't really believe it. Where's your husband?" Cynthia held back a wince at the last word. It was clear Maggie resented her for leaving Ethan, but what else could Cynthia have done after seeing what had happened to Ethan? But now, well, he was her best option. "I have divorced and come back home," Cynthia told her, lowering her head as if embarrassed. "May I have some water, Maggie? The trips made me so thirsty." Maggie hesitated, then grudgingly opened the front door for her. Cynthia walked in with a smile, gazing around. She had heard her own share of rumors she hadn't believed, namely, that Maggie had taken in a mail-order bride who had been supposed to marry old Carl, and her Indian baby. But it was clear it was all true now. There was a baby playing with old blocks in front of the couch, and when she looked up to stare at Cynthia, it was obvious she was indeed an Indian. "Ah," she said. "And who is this little one, Maggie? Your new baby?" "She belongs to a girl who lives here now," Maggie said, a bit forcefully. She swept the baby up into her arms and walked briskly to the kitchen. "Now, come drink your water, and then you can go back home." Cynthia didn't follow her deeper into the house, content to stay in the front room and gaze around at it. She noted some things had changed and some things hadn't, and she thought idly about what she would change when the house was hers. She turned around when she heard the front door opening. Ethan was more tanned and had a few lines around his face that she didn't remember, but aside from that, he looked exactly the same. His clear blue-gray eyes opened wide at seeing her, shocked. There was a woman beside him. She was blonde and seemed confused by Cynthia's presence. Cynthia smiled a wide, beaming smile. "My sweetheart," she exclaimed. Chapter 9. Ethan didn't notice Audrey's stricken face and barely saw it as she rushed inside the house, heading for the kitchen. He was too busy gaping at Cynthia, who was somehow standing in the middle of his house more than 1 year after she had forsaken him. Hadn't she left for the East? Wasn't she married now? What was she doing there? She had called him sweetheart. "Cynthia, what are you doing here?" he stammered. "I have so much to explain," she exclaimed, swishing to his side. She put a hand on his arm but didn't hug him. "I know we left things unfinished, and there's a lot to talk about." "Unfinished?" "You left me," he said and cringed as his voice came out more wounded than he wanted. "I can explain," Cynthia said, her bright eyes dark and pleading. "All right," he whispered. "Explain, Cynthia." She led him to the davenport, eyes pointedly away from his leg, and they sat down with 3 feet of space between them. Ethan had the irrational impulse to tuck her against his side like they had done so many times when they were together. He set his jaw, fighting the urge. "Ethan, leaving Pine Ridge was the biggest mistake of my life," she told him with tears in her eyes. "I was a fool. But we were about to marry, and I was so afraid of my feelings for you." "Afraid? And what about my leg?" he interrupted, his voice harsh. "It was never about your leg," she promised, a hand on his arm as if begging him to understand. "But you almost died, Ethan. I was so afraid, so terrified of losing you, and I couldn't stop thinking about how it could all happen again, so I left." Ethan's shoulders drooped, guilt, conflict, and relief swirled in his chest. "Oh, Cynthia. I'm sorry," she said, and he believed her. Ethan watched Cynthia's horse as she left the ranch and rode back to town. He didn't know what to think or what to feel. he had never in a million years imagined that Cynthia could come back. She spoke to him of the man she married without loving, of the empty life she'd had, of how much she had missed him, and Ethan felt like her life had been as bad as his own during the year they'd been separated. Had he been too hasty in entertaining thoughts of marrying Audrey? There was no denying that he liked Audrey, and he was sure he could love her. Audrey would be so easy to love. But the truth was that there were no guarantees that Audrey had feelings for him, too. Ethan knew that with his leg and his inability to have children, he wasn't easy to love. But Cynthia already knew all of this, and she had come back to him anyway. He couldn't deny it. He kept his eyes on the horizon even as Cynthia's figure became impossible to see. He couldn't ignore the fact that she had returned and that despite her mistakes, she still had a place in his heart. It's not like Audrey would ever love a man like me, one who could never give her a child, he told himself. I'm deluding myself. Maggie kneaded dough for lunch and watched from the corner of her eyes as Audrey bounced Faith in her arms to try and stop the babe from crying. Audrey had a strange expression on her face, and Maggie would be hard-pressed to try and guess what she was thinking if only she herself weren't also thinking it. If Ethan were here, he'd have calmed Faith down in half a second. But Ethan wasn't there, and Maggie recognized the disappointed corner of Audrey's mouth, the stiff, wounded way she held herself, and the slight redness in her eyes. Come on, girl, let's switch, Maggie said with a sigh. Give me the babe. Maybe I'll be able to calm her. Of course, Audrey said. I told you I should have been the one workin'. Taking care of a baby is also work, Audrey, Maggie told her firmly. She got the worst of the dough off her hands and took Faith from Audrey, and the baby immediately protested being taken away from her mother. Hush now, baby, what are you crying for? Audrey went to knead the dough, her hands firmer than Maggie could make hers, and they each worked in silence for a moment. Maggie, Audrey started, hesitant, her voice low. What do you think of Cynthia? Maggie winced, not wanting to answer the question. I'm sorry Ethan is spending so much time away, Maggie said instead, shaking her head. He went to town to buy some supplies, but it's the third time this week, Audrey completed for her. It's just an excuse for him to go and see her. I'm sorry, girl, Maggie said honestly. And Audrey didn't even know that Ethan had been thinking of proposing to her before Cynthia showed up again. Maggie didn't trust a hair on Cynthia's head, she could see right through her. But she had no way to convince Ethan that the woman's intentions weren't honorable, for he wouldn't listen to her. And now he was pushing Audrey, sweet, wonderful Audrey, aside. He was withdrawn and distant around her to the point that even Maggie could see it. The two of them stopped riding together, and now Ethan almost didn't look at her when he was at the table. Maggie didn't know what to do. Chapter 10. Audrey rode out to town on horseback. She was going to pick up some clothes from people she'd met at the church the last time she had gone there. They had shirts that needed mending and Audrey was glad for the money, and so it worked out. She had extra time now that she had gotten used to freeing time for riding with Ethan, which she wasn't doing anymore. In truth, she was devastated by what had happened to them. Why had Ethan's old flame returned just like that? Why had Ethan pushed Audrey aside to go back to spending time with the woman who'd hurt him? Audrey had started to fall for Ethan, and she thought he had felt the same way toward her, at least a bit. She must have misread things. Perhaps Ethan had just been a kind man who had wanted her to feel more comfortable. Maybe he felt bad for her because he knew her chances with any man were small, what with her taking on Faith. Maybe all this time there hadn't been nothing between them at all. Audrey had been so sure he had been on his way to asking if he could court her. She looked around town as she approached it and dreaded the thought that she could bump into Ethan and Cynthia as she made her way around the houses, picking up the mending. At the same time, she didn't want the two to be alone in Cynthia's house either. Audrey's heart felt wrenched apart in many directions. There was no way she could ever compete with a woman like Cynthia. Cynthia was tall and beautiful, with thick brown hair and brown eyes. Utterly lovely. She was confident and not shy, for hadn't she come to Ethan's house to tell him the whole story herself, with not a shred of shame for what she'd done? Perhaps it was better like this. Audrey's hands tightened around the horse's reins. The thought nearly made her cry, but she held it in. Ethan really was better off with Cynthia. After all, if things really had developed between him and Audrey, she would never have been able to give him a child. It's better this way, Audrey whispered to herself, her words swallowed by the wind. Maggie was sweeping the room when Ethan walked in with an absent smile on his face. Maggie knew at once that the man had gone to see Cynthia again while Maggie had stayed and listened to Audrey's sob all afternoon as she sewed in her room. Maggie had to try to reason with him. She had to try something. "Hello, Ethan," she said, putting a hand on her waist. "Hey, Ma," Ethan said, dropping an absent-minded kiss on Faith's little head. "How was your day?" "Interesting," Maggie said blithely. "You know, boy, I went to town yesterday to pick up some fruit from the Jennings, and..." Ethan tensed, but Maggie pressed forward. "They told me some interesting things about Cynthia," she completed, giving him a glare. "They say she only returned to our dear old town after she bankrupted her former husband. They say she only came back because she heard from her sister that you'd inherited the ranch from your father. To be honest, I'm disturbed, Ethan." "You can't listen to all that gossip," Ethan groused, waving a hand and making his way to his room. "I'll go wash up, Ma, and then..." "Don't turn your back on me, young man," Maggie snapped, and Ethan stilled. "You know there's more to this woman than it seems." "I'm trying to move on from the past," Ethan told her stiffly, without turning around to look at her. "I don't get it why you won't let me. I talked to Cynthia about what she did while we were apart, and I'm not going to listen to what her neighbors gossip about it." He walked away. Maggie sighed, disappointed and helpless, and looked down at Faith as the baby tried to crawl after Ethan. Ethan shared a picnic with Cynthia by the creek at his ranch and forgot about all the things his mother had told him. He smiled at Cynthia, admiring the honey gold of her eyes when the sun hit them, and tried not to consider any of the gossip he'd also heard around town. Cynthia smiled at him, and he smiled back at her. She spoke about her past, he told himself firmly. She said it was all a mistake, she said she regretted it, and that's why she came back, not for money. It was easy to convince himself of all this when the sun was warm, the creek was close, and Cynthia's eyes shone in the sun. "What are you thinking about, rancher?" she asked him, smiling at him with a raised eyebrow. "You look lost in thought." "Nothing," he lied with a shake of his head. Still, his thoughts veered away from Cynthia and back to Audrey. He had grown so distant from Audrey in these past days, it hurt him more than he had anticipated. It was strange to see Faith without Audrey, but now he was sure she was avoiding him, and it hurt to know it was his fault. But he hadn't the heart to continue a relationship with Audrey when he knew it would just make his feelings for her grow. "Well, eat up then," Cynthia said, clearly a bit annoyed. "I made all of this for you, but you're not even looking at it." "Sorry," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I don't know where my mind is, I keep thinking of things that aren't important. Sorry for not paying attention." And yet his attention veered away yet again. From the end of the creek and the direction of the house, Audrey was running toward them like the devil was snapping at her ankles, and Ethan sprung up at once. "Audrey," he shouted. "What's wrong?" When she got closer, it was clear that her eyes were filled with tears. "Ethan, please," she said. Chapter 11. "Audrey, tell me. What is it?" Ethan cried, his eyes wide with worry. He gripped at her arms with strong hands. "What's wrong? Tell me, is it my mother? Or, oh, no. Audrey, is Faith all right?" Audrey caught her breath. "Faith's had a fever all afternoon, and I don't know what to do," she told him, putting her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I don't know what to do. She won't stop crying and the fever won't go down. Maggie would know what to do, but she hasn't returned from going to town yet, and, please, Ethan. I've never had to care for anyone sick. I'm afraid I'll make her worse." "Calm down, don't worry," he said, and his voice was so sure and firm that Audrey found herself calming down at once, blinking her wide, terrified eyes at him. "We'll head back, and I'll help. I'll get the baby's fever down. Audrey. And we can send for the doc if we need to. Don't worry about a thing, all right? I'm here now." "All right," Audrey whispered. She gave Ethan a wobbly smile and he smiled back, wide and true, and Audrey realized this was the closest they had been in days. Cynthia cleared her throat. Ethan sprung back from Audrey and rubbed the back of his neck, but Audrey didn't really pay attention. She was too worried about her daughter. They set off to the ranch and Audrey noticed that although Ethan's limp was worse, Cynthia didn't even support him with her arm. That felt strange to her. Surely the woman would feel the need to help Ethan? Audrey herself had done it so frequently, before. But now, she didn't have the courage to try anymore. Let Cynthia see if Ethan needed help or not. Ethan changed Faith's clothes, rocked her in his arms, and pressed a cold damp cloth to her forehead. He made a poultice and applied it to her little chest. Little by little, while Audrey made tea for a silent, stony Cynthia, he managed to bring the baby's fever down. It felt like a miracle in and of itself. Audrey wept, glad and relieved, when he came to tell her, thinking that God had sent her many miracles in her life, yet this one had been the best by far. Cynthia drank her tea and glared at Audrey. Ethan had just passed by to tell them that the Indian child was better. Audrey had burst into tears. She was now sipping her tea and dabbing a handkerchief at her eyes. She had sat next to Cynthia, and Cynthia seethed with annoyance. When Ethan had passed by, he hadn't even looked her in the face. As if this baby were more important to him than she was. Audrey had interrupted their picnic and didn't even appear sorry about it, and worst of all, neither did Ethan. It was obvious to Cynthia from the way that Audrey looked at Ethan that she had feelings for him, and the last thing Cynthia wanted was for this woman to somehow steal her man and destroy all of her plans. It was enough that the two of them had spent time alone before Cynthia had arrived. She didn't want them together at all anymore. It was too much, too risky. Especially since it was obvious by the way Ethan looked at that woman that he had feelings for her, too. "Audrey," Cynthia said lightly, careful not to let her any scorn into her voice, "have you heard the news?" Audrey lifted her tired, distracted gaze up to her. "What news?" "Ethan and I are planning to wed soon," she lied, her voice so smooth that there was no way Audrey would realize it wasn't the absolute truth. "I just remembered to tell you because, well, it will be hard for you to take care of little Faith alone once you're out of here, right? Poor thing. Maggie really has been so good to you, but it's not like you can stay here forever. I mean, not after Ethan and I marry, right?" Audrey stared at her in shock. I suppose," she choked out. "I'm sure you will be able to find a good place," Cynthia said, giving her a false smile. "And Maggie will be able to help you find your way, of course. But, the two of us will be married, you know. You can't linger in this house like you've been doing for months now." Audrey's face contorted in a way that made it obvious she was trying not to cry again. Redness rose to her cheeks. Good. She was embarrassed, humiliated, even. Cynthia smiled. I should think about what I'm going to do," Audrey agreed, looking deep into her cup of tea instead of at Cynthia. Cynthia's smile widened. "There are many ranches around," Cynthia told her. "Or maybe, could you put up another mail-order-bride advert? There is always hope. And you're not even divorced like me. You will see, things will work out. You know, they will work out far away from here, that is." Audrey's entire body drooped with embarrassment and disappointment, and she didn't answer. Cynthia went back to her tea, happy with her results. Maybe Ethan liked this woman, but there was no way anything could happen between them when Audrey moved out of the area. Cynthia would make sure, even if she had to hold Audrey's hand every step of the way, even if she had to buy her a ticket to a place very far away. Audrey lay in bed that evening and stared up at the ceiling. It was a familiar ceiling to her, now that she had lived here at the ranch for months. She was gripped with a sense that she had lived through this before, lying on a familiar bed and staring at a familiar ceiling with dread, fear, and regret like a weight around her. She never thought this ranch would end up feeling like the hospital back in Boston had felt. It was a strange thought to think she would have to leave soon. She hadn't forgotten that she didn't actually belong to this family, but it would be a lie to say that she hadn't settled in here or wondered if they would let her stay. Evidently, they would not. Her time was up, and she needed a new plan. As much as it broke her heart, and dear God, it felt like a wound, like Cynthia had torn her heart out of her chest, she knew Cynthia was right. When Cynthia and Ethan married, she couldn't stay anymore. No matter how much Audrey loved Ethan, she wasn't the kind of woman who would linger around when the newlyweds would be trying to sort out their new life together. What could she hope for? There wasn't anything but bitter disappointment and resentment in a future like that. She'd better go out and find a new life. It hurt her deeply to think about everything she would lose by leaving this place. It was likely she would never see Ethan again. He'd be happily married to Cynthia, while she went God knew where. He would have a dozen beautiful brown-eyed babies with his wife, while Audrey would. Audrey would probably spend the rest of her life alone, like she had feared. Except for Faith. She thanked God for the precious child. Her mail-order bride advert hadn't gone well. Could she even afford to take that chance again, to head out into the unknown after a man who would leave her as easily as Carl had left her, unceremoniously, and without pity or compassion? She had some money from mending the townsfolk's clothes, and it should be enough to buy a train ticket out of Pine Ridge. She'd leave this town and go somewhere close, where she would try to find a place to stay and maybe find more women in a situation like hers. Perhaps they could help each other. It shouldn't be impossible, should it? Surely there were other women out there who, like her, were just trying to make a life. It'd be an uncertain business, of course, but it's no life for a baby, Audrey realized suddenly. Her eyes grew wide with shock and dread. She turned to look at Faith. The baby was sleeping soundly, utterly all right after Ethan had cared for her. She was lying in the cradle Maggie had given her weeks ago, not a care in the world. Audrey stood up from the bed and approached the baby, looking down at her tenderly. Faith didn't deserve to have her world turned upside down, and Audrey would have no way to take care of her besides. At least, at first. Audrey couldn't be selfish. She had to think of what was best for the child. She had to, no matter how it broke her heart. She could only pray, her heart in her throat, that Maggie would be willing to raise the little girl. If not, Audrey had no idea what to do. What if Cynthia didn't accept Faith? What if Ethan was swayed by her, and they left Faith somewhere? But Maggie would not let anyone do something like that. But Maggie would not be there forever, Audrey thought, thinking about her own poor mother. Still, this was her only hope. Her resolve made, Audrey steeled herself. There was no advantage in waiting. Life happened in the now, after all, and more than anything, Audrey didn't want to stay here and watch as Cynthia and Ethan prepared for their wedding. She would not be able to handle it. Chapter 12. Audrey walked to the other side of the room and got some paper from the cupboard in the corner by the bed and set it on top of the nightstand. She began to write a letter. Dearest Maggie. I write this letter with many tears and an aching heart. Since Ethan and Cynthia are going forward with their plans to marry, it's time for me to move on. I don't know what my situation will be. I'll try to find work as soon as I can. But Maggie, I can't take little Faith with me. Not when I don't even know where my next meal is coming from. I don't worry for myself, but I do worry for Faith. Please, please, will you look after her? I'll send any money I make as quickly as I can. And someday, I hope to return to take her with me again. I am so grateful to you, Maggie. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I have loved my time here with you. Anne. Audrey stopped and swallowed back her tears before continuing. And I love Ethan. I didn't mean to love him, but I do. Yet I am fully aware that it makes no difference now. You'll be in my heart always. I'll wire money as soon as I get a job. Thank you for everything. Audrey. A part of her wanted to write more words to Ethan, to beg him to reconsider marrying Cynthia, to tell him more, but she just couldn't. Her heart couldn't take it, and besides, what would she even say? If he was marrying Cynthia, he had already made his choice. She would not humiliate herself by trying to sway a man who had already made up his mind, who hadn't even considered her an option after his old flame returned. She put the letter on top of her bed and with a heavy heart, she packed her few belongings. It was strange that the life she'd had here could be packed up in such a small bag. The very one she had arrived with. She kissed a sleeping Faith goodbye, pressing the memory of her little girl into her mind's eye, promising herself that she would do right by her even if they might never see each other again. Then, she slipped out of the house in the early hours of the morning. Maggie woke up earlier than she meant to with a babe's cry. She groaned, rubbing a hand over her face, and waited for Audrey to calm her down. It never happened. Maggie waited longer and longer, and Faith continued crying, and she could hear no hint that Audrey was even trying to make her stop. There was no murmuring to be heard, no soft songs, no pacing. Maggie furrowed her brow. Had the girl not woken up with the baby's cries? Had Audrey exhausted herself with work so badly the day before? Maybe Maggie should stop letting the young woman take on so much work, even if it made Maggie's life easier. Soon it became too much, and Maggie got up to see what was happening. She was surprised when she opened the door and saw that the bed was unoccupied, and Faith was still in her cradle. Maggie peered around the room, but Audrey wasn't there. Maggie's heart went to her throat. Where was the young woman? She picked up Faith, lifting her to her shoulder, and slowly the baby's cries petered out. Maggie looked again, even out to the hallway, but Audrey wasn't anywhere to be seen. She caught sight of a letter on top of the bed, and felt her stomach fall to the floor. She sat down and picked it up, and what she read made her hands tremble. Audrey was gone. She said in this heartbreaking letter that she couldn't stay now that Ethan and Cynthia were marrying. Maggie was confused, because she knew there had been no talk of that. She knew her son, and he would come talk it over with her, confide in her if he was thinking of it, just like he had indeed done when he had been thinking of asking for Audrey's hand. And yet, Audrey seemed absolutely convinced this marriage was going forward. In the letter, she begged Maggie to take care of Faith as if Maggie would not have done so with no questions asked, and in a heartbeat. Maggie lifted a hand to cover her mouth, and Faith, sensing her sorrow, burst into tears again. "Ethan!" Maggie shouted. "Ethan, come here." Ethan helped Cynthia down from the horse and frowned at his mother, worried and confused. He'd just returned after fetching Cynthia in town and he was tired, as was Cynthia. He regretted promising Cynthia that he'd fetch her so early, but she'd insisted, saying that she wanted very much to cook his family breakfast and surprise them. But what could his mother want now, before the sun was barely up? She burst out of the house with a crying Faith in her arms and a wrinkled letter in her hands. Ethan's eyebrows furrowed down in worry, and he was tired enough that it took him a moment to process the sight. "Ethan, Audrey has left," his mother wailed. "Read this." Ethan felt his heart freeze in his chest. Audrey has left? He thought, shocked and betrayed. Wait? What right did he have to feel betrayed? He shook his head to clear his thoughts, crossing his arms. Who was he to say anything if Audrey wanted to leave? He caught sight of Cynthia's victorious look and felt his eyebrows furrow even further. He couldn't think of anything Cynthia had to feel victorious about, unless she had something to do with Audrey leaving. He took the letter from his mother and read it. "Marriage," he exclaimed, turning around to stare at Cynthia. "Cynthia, did you tell Audrey we were going to marry? We haven't spoken about marriage. Why would you do this?" Cynthia winced, but didn't back down. "What was I supposed to do, sit by while she distracted you? I'm here for a reason, you know." Ethan's breath came quickly. "What reason?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. He knew there was something strange with Cynthia's words, an edge of something more. Suddenly, he felt very awake. Cynthia was presuming an awful lot. She couldn't wave his worries away so easily now, not when Audrey had simply gotten up before the sun had risen and left. And she had gone without taking Faith with her. It must have broken her heart. "I love you," Cynthia said quickly, but it was too late. He didn't believe her. How could he? She seemed to be lying quite a lot lately. Especially to Audrey. Cynthia probably didn't love him at all. He suddenly remembered all the rumors he'd heard in town, the ones he'd so carefully ignored. So, they're true. Ethan breathed out, feeling defeated. The things they were saying in town. "You really did just come back from my ranch. You don't care a fig about me. You have lied to me all along." Cynthia flinched. "It's not like that, Ethan. I love you. Are you going to believe everyone in town but not me? You said you didn't believe all that gossip. What's changed?" "Nothing, I tell you. I love you." "Why else would you lie to Audrey?" he snapped, his hands closing in fists. Everything became painfully clear. He was a fool. A blind fool. "You weren't worried about her distracting me, you were worried about her making me see the truth, like my mother has been trying to make me see all this time. Oh, dear, dear God, I've been a fool, and now Audrey's gone." He'd been such an idiot. Audrey was the one who loved him, and now she had left him because of his own stupidity. Cynthia didn't care about him at all. How could he have been so blind? Audrey was the one who had been kind, who had stood by him, who had helped him when he needed it. Suddenly, he realized that not once had Cynthia helped him walk like Audrey had done without a word, as easy as breathing, as if Ethan's leg were nothing more than a normal part of life. Audrey was sweet. And brave and good and kind. How in the world had he gotten so off track? "I can't believe you did this," he said. He shook his head and without another word, he left them standing there. He had to go, and go quickly. With God's help, maybe he could fix this. Chapter 13. Ethan got onto his horse and galloped away, and he didn't even know where he was going. He wasn't thinking, all he knew was that he had to hurry. He was too angry and too guilty to think about anything except how much of an idiot he had been all these months. He had been so waylaid by the fact that Cynthia had returned to town that he didn't realize Audrey was the one he loved. The thought that she was leaving, that she had left, was a bitter taste in his mouth and a rock in his stomach. Days and days had passed since the last time he had truly spoken to her. How could he have let this happen? How could he have missed the fact that Cynthia was devious and scheming? And now, she had chased away the woman he truly loved. Audrey was gone to who knew where, and the West was too large for him to search alone, much less on horseback. Maybe, a small part of his mind piped up while he galloped, maybe Audrey's train hasn't taken off yet. Surely, she was planning to leave by train. He yanked up on the reins, his horse complaining about the abruptness of his move. Ethan breathed hard, his hands so tight around the reins that his knuckles were white. His heart pounded in his chest. Maybe Audrey hasn't left yet, he thought again, and his heart filled with something pure and cleansing that he recognized as hope. He kicked his horse's flanks and started galloping again, turning around to where he knew the train station lay. He could see the tracks in the distance, and the blurred shadow of an approaching train. There's a chance, he thought, and it was a chant in his mind. There's a chance, there's a chance. God is on my side, and there is a chance I can make it. But what if it was too late? And would Audrey ever forgive him for so naively believing Cynthia and taking her back? He didn't want to think about it, but the nagging worry wouldn't leave him. What if Audrey had left not only because Cynthia had driven her away, but because she realized she didn't want a life with him? He was humiliated. Audrey didn't even know he couldn't have children yet. Cynthia knew this and accepted him, had seemed to accept him, at least. But Audrey didn't know. Would she leave him when she learned it? What woman wouldn't want to raise any children of her own? But there is faith, he thought. And that gave him strength. Ethan arrived so quickly at the station that he felt dizzy, and when he dismounted from his horse, his bad leg buckled, and he nearly fell down. His body was aching in so many places, it was a miracle he had managed to arrive. Someone, he didn't recognize who, helped him up with a firm hand on his shoulder and asked him if he was okay. He nodded quickly and entered the station. He'd thank the man later, but right now he had a goal. Audrey had to be here. He stumbled in, limping the worst he'd limped in weeks now, looking around for a familiar head of strawberry blonde hair. Please, please, he prayed. Please, God, let her be here. He saw her standing right next to the far door, waiting in line to board the train, and he felt so relieved he might have wept. Audrey, he cried, approaching as quickly as he could. Audrey. She turned around to look at him, her blue eyes wide with shock. He rushed to her and gathered her up in his arms and hugged her. Audrey, I'm so sorry, he told her, his words stumbling over each other in his haste to say them. I was such a fool to go after Cynthia, to believe the things she said. When I read your letter, I realized I couldn't let you leave. I realized how much I love you, just how deeply I love you. Cynthia lied to you. Ethan, please, Audrey said, voice full of tears, and Ethan let go of her. He kept her at arm's length, and his heart broke at her tears. Ethan, I can't give you the life you want, she said, shaking her head, putting a hand over her mouth. Her voice was so low and muffled, he could barely hear her. Ethan, I never said anything but. I'm barren. Ethan stared at her, then he started to laugh, full of joy. She stared at him, uncomprehending. Are you making fun of me? Do you think this is? I am, too, Ethan told her, and laughed again at just how absurd this all was. He lowered his voice. I mean, Audrey, I can't have children either. Because of my accident, I can't. Oh, God. He really sent you to my life. You really are perfect, Audrey. Overwhelmed, Audrey's hand fell from her mouth. Why you can't, she stammered. But together, he said, we have faith. Oh, she said, choked up. You'd accept her? Just like that? As your daughter? What about? I already accept her, Ethan told her softly. I already consider her mine. Audrey, please. Won't you accept me? He went down on his good knee. I was a fool, he murmured, holding her hands in his. I was such a fool. I love you. Will you marry me? Audrey burst into tears, her face absolutely red. Yes, she whispered. Epilogue. Ethan and Audrey married a week later at the ranch, with a few friends and family around them, and faith in Maggie's arms. Audrey's heart was absolutely filled with love. Ethan couldn't stop grinning. Some cattle drive friends of his had managed to come, a pair named John and Jack. Audrey smiled under her husband's arm as the three men spoke animatedly with each other. Audrey, Ethan said, squeezing her shoulders. Jack and John were with me when my horse was bit by a snake and fell on top of me. They saved my life. Audrey turned to the men with a new respect in her eyes, retroactive fear making her grip at her chest. Oh. Ethan, don't joke, one said. We couldn't do anything. You're the one who worked that horse like a miracle. I swear, any other man would have fallen off right away. Maybe it would have been better if I had fallen, though, Ethan said quietly. But this was a happy day, and his good mood soon returned. What about you, John? Did you find a wife yet? I was half expecting you two to each come with a woman on your arm, but here you are, both of you alone. I belong on the road, Jack said with a laugh. I belong to the West, Ethan, but I don't think a newlywed like yourself would understand. The three of them burst into laughter, pulling Audrey along with them. Maggie approached with Faith, who perked up when she saw Audrey. Audrey beamed at her, their daughter, and caught the baby up in her arms. One of the men, maybe John, looked at Faith and lifted one eyebrow. Wow, Ethan, you got busy, he said. How did you have her before the wedding? You dog. We are blessed to have her, Audrey said, beaming with pride, not taking the time right then to share the entire story. "She's our daughter," Ethan said firmly, dropping a kiss on the baby's head. "This is Faith. Little Faith, these are John and Jack, they saved your daddy's life." "Well, she's a beauty," Jack said, delighted. Audrey laughed, hugging her child close to her chest, and relaxed against Maggie's side when the woman wound an arm around her waist. This was her family now, Audrey thought, this woman, this man, and everyone that came along with them. Soon Ethan's sister would return from her trip back east and Audrey would get to meet her. She'd meet her nephews, and little Faith would meet her cousins. She knew, standing there on her husband's arm, that it was going to be a wonderful life. She closed her eyes, just for an instant, and sent up a prayer of thanks. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.